That janitor owns everything you spent your life chasing. Richard Whitmore's champagne glass slipped from his fingers. Crystal shattered across the marble floor beneath him. The ballroom suddenly felt ice cold. Cameras stopped moving. Breathing stopped with them. The giant screen behind him glowed softly in blue light. Amara Brooks stood frozen near the back wall. Her gray janitor uniform looked painfully out of place. Richard stared at her like she was a mistake. Like someone had switched names. Like reality suddenly betrayed him. Then Evelyn Carter adjusted her glasses calmly. Ms. Brooks inherited the entire Bennett estate. Silence swallowed the room. 20 years earlier, Richard Whitmore hated small apartments and unpaid bills. He hated cracked windows and old furniture. Most of all, he hated feeling poor. Rain struck the apartment windows that night. Vanessa Brooks held baby Amara against her chest. Richard zipped his suitcase without looking up once. Vanessa never cried. She only watched him quietly. "I will not waste my life being broke," Richard finally said. The elevator doors closed slowly afterward. Some sounds never leave people completely. 20 years later, Whitmore Holdings touched Chicago clouds every morning. Glass towers reflected sunlight across downtown streets. Richard built an empire from steel and ambition. He wore custom suits and expensive watches daily. His face appeared inside magazines and business journals monthly. Meanwhile, every night another person entered his building unnoticed. Amara Brooks pushed her cleaning cart through executive hallways quietly. Most employees ignored her existence completely. Some barely remembered her name. Others left coffee cups and paperwork everywhere carelessly. "Janitors clean," one executive joked during meetings. Thinking is not really their department. Amara never answered them. She simply smiled and continued working. But every Tuesday night something strange happened upstairs. Financial reports kept coming back fixed by morning. System errors disappeared before morning meetings began. Missing files suddenly returned untouched. Numbers aligned perfectly overnight. Richard believed his managers fixed everything themselves. He never noticed Amara staying 40 extra minutes nightly. Tonight she stood beside her cleaning cart silently. Her eyes rested on the glowing ballroom screen. Then her phone vibrated once inside her pocket. The message came from Harold Bennett earlier that morning. 3 words waited beneath his name. "Open it tonight." Amara looked down slowly. Then she pulled a sealed envelope free. Amara stared at the envelope without moving her hands. Music slowly returned inside the ballroom. Again, people whispered behind expensive smiles and half-empty glasses. Richard still watched her from across the room. His face looked tight beneath the bright ceiling lights. He had spent his whole life controlling every room. Tonight that control started slipping quietly away. Amara finally opened the envelope carefully. One folded photograph slipped onto her palm first. A little girl smiled beside an older man. The girl held melting ice cream happily. The man laughed toward the camera naturally. Amara stopped breathing for a second. Harold Bennett stood beside her in the picture. She looked around 7 years old there. Richard frowned from across the room immediately. He had never seen that photograph before. He had never seen that smile either. Evelyn slowly walked toward Amara afterward. "Mr. Bennett wanted you to see that first," she said softly. Richard stepped closer immediately. "Why does she have that picture?" he demanded sharply. Evelyn never looked at him once. "Because it belongs to her," she answered calmly. 3 executives exchanged confused looks nearby. One leaned toward another quietly. "Harold trusted very few people," he whispered. "Especially with personal things." Richard heard enough to turn pale. The room suddenly felt smaller around him. Then his assistant hurried toward him quickly. Sweat covered his forehead now. "Sir, there is another issue downstairs," he said nervously. Richard looked annoyed immediately. "Handle it yourself," he snapped back. His assistant swallowed hard. "We cannot, sir." Richard stared at him silently. "The finance servers crashed 20 minutes ago," he continued softly. "Reports disappeared before tomorrow's shareholder meeting." Richard's jaw tightened immediately. Another executive joined them seconds later. "The inventory system failed too," she added carefully. "Nothing is syncing correctly anymore." Richard rubbed his forehead slowly. That never happened before. Another manager stepped forward suddenly. "Sir, security logs are missing entries tonight." Richard looked toward Amara instinctively. She stood near the ballroom window quietly. Her cleaning cart waited beside the wall alone. Then his assistant said something almost accidentally. "Actually, Ms. Brooks usually notices problems before they spread." Richard slowly turned his head. What did you just say? The assistant froze completely. His eyes moved toward Amara carefully. Sir, she stays late most nights. She catches small issues nobody sees. Harold offered her different roles before. She always turned them down. Richard stared toward Amara again. The quiet woman standing near the window suddenly looked different. Not important yet. Just harder to explain. Then his assistant looked back at him carefully. Sir, why would a janitor know more about this building than everyone upstairs? Richard stood near the ballroom doors without saying anything. People moved around him carefully now. Nobody smiled the same way anymore. Nobody laughed around him either. Meanwhile, Amara stood beside Evelyn quietly. Her cleaning cart remained against the wall untouched. For years people looked through her completely. Tonight people started looking at her differently. A young employee walked toward her nervously. Ms. Brooks, thank you for last month, he said softly. Amara looked confused for a second. My mother needed surgery, he continued carefully. Human Resources denied my emergency request. He smiled weakly afterward. You showed me another way. Amara lowered her eyes quietly. I only sent an email, she answered. Another woman stepped forward slowly. Then another one followed beside her. Richard watched them gather around Amara carefully. You fixed my payroll issue, someone said. You found my missing paperwork, another person added. You caught those inventory errors, another voice said quietly. Richard frowned immediately. Inventory errors. Finance reports. Missing files. His mind returned to earlier conversations quickly. More people started stopping near Amara now. The strange part felt simple. Nobody looked forced or uncomfortable. Nobody wanted money from her. They looked grateful instead. Richard spent years buying loyalty with checks and promotions. Amara earned something different without trying. Richard hated noticing that difference. Then his assistant leaned closer again. Sir, there is more, he whispered nervously. Richard closed his eyes briefly. What now? He asked coldly. His assistant swallowed carefully. 3 department managers want to speak with Ms. Brooks. Richard looked at him immediately. For what? The answer came faster than expected. They think she can help stabilize operations. Richard stared toward Amara again. For the first time tonight, he saw movement changing around her. Executives stopped interrupting her. Employees opened space around her naturally. One manager even pulled out a chair nearby. Hours earlier, nobody remembered her name. Tonight, people suddenly waited for her answers. Richard felt something unfamiliar inside his chest. It was not anger. It was not confusion either. It felt worse. Then Evelyn handed Amara a small folder quietly. Amara opened it slowly beneath the ballroom lights. Her eyes widened immediately. Richard saw color disappear from her face. What is inside that folder? He asked sharply. Evelyn looked toward him. Finally, her expression never changed. Mr. Bennett requested she see this before midnight. Richard stepped forward instantly. Then Amara looked up at him for the first time that night. Why does this file have childhood pictures of me? The room went quiet for a different reason now. People were no longer whispering about money. People were whispering about Amara instead. Richard walked toward her slowly this time. Not like a boss approaching an employee. More like a man chasing an answer. Amara kept looking through the folder quietly. Small photographs covered the pages inside. Birthday pictures appeared one after another. School events followed after those. A science fair ribbon sat between old papers carefully. Richard finally stopped beside her. Where did those come from? He asked softly. Amara looked at him calmly. I was about to ask the same thing. Richard reached toward the folder slowly. Amara closed it immediately. His hand stopped in the air awkwardly. Earlier that night, he would never have paused. Earlier that night, she would have lowered her eyes. Tonight nobody moved for him. Several managers suddenly approached Amara carefully. Ms. Brooks, one manager said politely. Could we get copies of your correction notes? Richard frowned immediately. What notes? He asked sharply. A young analyst stepped closer. Ms. Brooks has been leaving warning notes for months, he explained. Nobody knew who kept fixing things. Richard looked toward Amara silently. The same woman carrying trash bags every night had been quietly holding problems together. Another manager raised a tablet screen. We used her notes tonight, he explained. They helped us recover most of the systems. Richard stared at the screen carefully. Her notes, he repeated quietly. Then something changed around the room. Earlier people gave Amara instructions. Tonight people started asking her questions. Earlier people walked past her without noticing. Tonight people waited for her answers. Richard felt something uncomfortable settle inside his chest. Then one executive approached Amara slowly. Richard recognized him immediately. The man respected almost nobody. "Ms. Brooks," he said seriously, "Whitmore Holdings owes you a conversation." Richard blinked once. Nobody invited janitors into executive discussions. Nobody. Yet another chair quietly appeared beside Amara moments later. Nobody announced it. Nobody asked Richard first. People simply made space for her naturally. Richard remained standing beside her. For the first time in years, he looked like the extra person inside his own room. The feeling landed harder than expected. Then Evelyn stepped beside them quietly. She handed Amara another envelope. Richard looked frustrated immediately. "Enough with these envelopes," he snapped. Evelyn finally looked directly at him. "Mr. Bennett prepared these records over many years." Richard felt his chest tighten suddenly. Years. The word stayed inside his head. Years earlier, he walked away from one apartment. Years later, another man collected years of memories. Amara slowly turned over the new envelope. Her fingers suddenly stopped moving. Richard saw her face change immediately. "What is inside that folder?" he asked quickly. Amara looked up slowly. Then she read the handwriting aloud. "For Amara. From your mother. The truth I promised to protect." Amara stared at the envelope without opening it immediately. The room waited with her. Even the background music felt far away now. Richard watched every movement carefully. His eyes stayed fixed on her hands. Evelyn spoke softly beside her. "Mr. Bennett asked for one thing tonight." Amara looked toward her slowly. He wanted truth to arrive at the right time. Richard let out a heavy breath. He hated waiting for answers. Waiting meant losing control. Suddenly, another manager hurried into the ballroom quickly. "We recovered everything," he announced loudly. Several people looked up immediately. "The systems are stable again," he continued. "Reports are back online now." Richard nodded automatically. "Good," he answered flatly. The manager looked confused for a second. Then he turned toward Amara instead. "Actually, we followed Ms. Brooks's correction notes," he explained. "She labeled every issue months before they happened." Richard looked toward him sharply. "Months before?" he asked quietly. Another employee raised a tablet screen. Charts and timestamps covered the display. "She tracked patterns every night," he explained. "Nobody asked her to do this." Another voice joined nearby. "She prevented 2 audit failures last spring. She caught vendor errors during winter contracts. She stopped payroll problems before legal complaints started." Richard stared silently at Amara. Then his face hardened suddenly. "This proves nothing," he said coldly. The room turned toward him immediately. "Harold planned all this. Someone manipulated these files. Someone wanted this tonight to happen." Nobody answered him right away. Then his assistant stepped closer carefully. "Sir, the timestamps cannot be changed." Richard looked toward him instantly. "What?" he asked sharply. His assistant swallowed hard. "These records came from archived internal systems. The notes go back several years." Another executive looked toward Richard slowly. "I remember these reports," he said quietly. "We thought Bennett hired outside consultants." Another manager nodded immediately. "Those reports saved us millions." Richard felt something shift beneath his feet. He looked around the room slowly. Nobody looked uncertain anymore. Nobody questioned Amara now. Then his assistant spoke again. "Sir, there is another issue downstairs." Richard rubbed his forehead tiredly. "What now?" he asked softly. "Board members requested an emergency meeting." Richard looked confused immediately. "About the inheritance?" he asked. His assistant shook his head slowly. "No, sir. They are asking serious questions about leadership." Silence landed hard. Richard suddenly looked toward Amara again. Earlier tonight, he thought she cleaned his company. Tonight, he started wondering if she had been quietly carrying it. Then Amara finally opened Vanessa's envelope carefully. One folded page slipped onto her lap first. Then another paper followed underneath. Evelyn looked down once and froze completely. The color drained from her face. Richard stepped closer immediately. "What is it?" he asked quickly. Evelyn slowly looked up at him. "Mr. Whitmore," she whispered softly. "Why does your signature appear on hospital documents dated 20 years ago?" Richard stared at Evelyn without blinking once. The room suddenly felt too small around him. He grabbed the hospital paper carefully. His eyes moved across every line slowly. Then his fingers stopped moving completely. The signature belonged to him. The date belonged to him too. 20 years earlier. Rain. Hospital lights. Vanessa. Baby Amara. Richard felt something cold move through his chest. This does not make sense, he whispered quietly. Evelyn took another paper from the folder. There is more here, she said softly. Amara stayed silent beside her. She looked confused now. Not scared anymore. Confused. Evelyn unfolded several old payment records carefully. Hospital bills appeared one after another. School tuition followed behind them. Apartment rent payments came next. Richard looked down immediately. Harold Bennett paid every single one. 20 years of support filled those papers. Richard felt his stomach tighten. Then another document appeared underneath. A business report from years earlier. Richard frowned immediately. He remembered that report clearly. It saved Whitmore Holdings during a difficult year. That contract changed everything for his company. He still remembered celebrating that deal publicly. He remembered cameras and interviews afterward. He remembered calling it his greatest business decision. Then Evelyn looked toward him carefully. Mr. Bennett attached notes too. This file, she said. Richard looked up slowly. Read them, he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. System vulnerabilities discovered by Amara Brooks. Silence landed instantly across the room. Richard looked toward Amara again. No, he whispered immediately. Evelyn continued reading. Vendor risks identified by Amara Brooks. Another line followed afterward. Financial exposure prevented through her recommendations. Richard shook his head slowly. No, his voice sounded weaker now. One manager stepped closer suddenly. I remember this, he said carefully. We thought Mr. Bennett sent anonymous consultants. Another executive nodded immediately. Those reports saved us millions, he added. Richard looked around the room slowly. Nobody looked uncertain anymore. Nobody questioned Amara now. Then his assistant pulled out archived company files. Sir, he said quietly. The same handwriting appears everywhere. Richard stared at the pages. Small notes covered the margins. Correction marks. Warnings. Suggestions. Night after night. Year after year. The woman carrying cleaning supplies had been fixing problems nobody saw. Richard built towers and gave speeches. But someone else kept stopping the cracks underneath. Suddenly his success felt different. Smaller somehow. Then Amara reached into Vanessa's envelope again. One final folded paper slipped onto her lap slowly. Her hands froze instantly. Evelyn looked at it once. Then the color drained from her face completely. Richard stepped closer immediately. What is it? He asked. Amara looked up with tears gathering softly. Why did my mother write, "Do not tell Richard the truth about his daughter"? The room went quiet for a different reason now. People were no longer whispering about money. People were whispering about Amara instead. Richard walked toward her slowly this time. Not like a boss approaching an employee. More like a man chasing an answer. Amara kept looking through the folder quietly. Small photographs covered the pages inside. Birthday pictures appeared one after another. School events followed after those. A science fair ribbon sat between old papers carefully. Richard finally stopped beside her. Where did those come from? He asked softly. Amara looked at him calmly. I was about to ask the same thing. Richard reached toward the folder slowly. Amara closed it immediately. His hand stopped in the air awkwardly. Earlier that night, he would never have paused. Earlier that night, she would have lowered her eyes. Tonight nobody moved for him. Several managers suddenly approached Amara carefully. Ms. Brooks, one manager said politely. Could we get copies of your correction notes? Richard frowned immediately. What notes? He asked sharply. A young analyst stepped closer. Ms. Brooks has been leaving warning notes for months, he explained. Nobody knew who kept fixing things. Richard looked toward Amara silently. The same woman carrying trash bags every night suddenly seemed harder to ignore. Another manager raised a tablet screen. We used her notes tonight, he explained. They helped us recover most of the systems. Richard stared at the screen carefully. Her notes, he repeated quietly. Then something changed around the room. Earlier people gave Amara instructions. Tonight people started asking her questions. Earlier people walked past her without noticing. Tonight people waited for her answers. Richard felt something uncomfortable settle inside his chest. Then one executive approached Amara slowly. Richard recognized him immediately. The man respected almost nobody. Ms. Brooks, he said seriously. Whitmore Holdings owes you a conversation. Richard blinked once. Nobody invited janitors into executive discussions. Nobody. Yet another chair quietly appeared beside Amara moments later. Nobody announced it. Nobody asked Richard first. People simply made space for her naturally. Richard remained standing beside her. For the first time in years, he looked like the extra person inside his own room. The feeling landed harder than expected. Then Evelyn stepped beside them quietly. She handed Amara another envelope. Richard looked frustrated immediately. "Enough with these envelopes," he snapped. Evelyn finally looked directly at him. "Mr. Bennett prepared these records over many years." Richard felt his chest tighten suddenly. Years. The word stayed inside his head. Years earlier, he walked away from one apartment. Years later, another man collected years of memories. Amara slowly turned over the new envelope. Her fingers suddenly stopped moving. Richard saw her face change immediately. "What is inside that folder?" he asked quickly. Amara looked up slowly. Then she read the handwriting aloud. "For Amara. From your mother. The truth I promised to protect." The conference room lights dimmed slowly above the long table. Nobody spoke after the doors closed behind them. Amara sat quietly beside the window. Vanessa's letter rested against her hands gently. Richard stood near the back wall silently. For the first time in years, he looked unsure. Evelyn pressed a button on the remote carefully. Vanessa appeared on the screen seconds later. The video quality looked old and grainy. Soft hospital light touched her face gently. She looked tired but peaceful somehow. Richard forgot to breathe for a moment. Vanessa looked directly toward the camera slowly. "If Amara sees this someday," she began softly, "then I probably could not protect her anymore." Amara lowered her eyes immediately. Vanessa smiled weakly on the screen. "Baby, I never wanted you carrying my pain." Silence filled every corner of the room. "Your father did leave us," Vanessa continued quietly. Richard closed his eyes immediately. "But I did not hide you because of hate." Amara looked up suddenly. Richard looked up too. "I hid you because I knew him." Vanessa's voice stayed calm afterward. "He loved winning more than people. He loved building things more than keeping them." Richard slowly sat down nearby. Nobody looked at him anymore. Vanessa looked straight into the camera again. Some people abandon families once. Others abandon them slowly every day afterward. Richard lowered his head completely. Amara never looked toward him. Then Vanessa smiled again softly. "But Mr. Bennett never let us fall. He showed up every birthday. He sat through every school play. He stayed beside hospital beds." Richard felt his chest tighten. Every memory he missed suddenly belonged to another man. Every empty chair had someone else sitting there. Then Vanessa's face became serious. "Amara, if he ever comes back later, do not hate him." Richard looked up instantly. "Just do not wait for him." Amara's eyes filled slowly. Still she never cried. Richard stood up suddenly. "Amara," he whispered carefully. She finally looked toward him. "I did not know," he said softly. "I would give anything back." Amara stared at him quietly. Then she stood slowly from her chair. "You keep saying that," she answered calmly. "But you were still talking about yourself." Richard froze immediately. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Amara picked up Vanessa's letter gently. "Mr. Bennett gave me safety. My mother gave me strength. You gave me absence." Richard looked like something inside him collapsed completely. Then Amara stepped toward the doorway calmly. Before opening it, she stopped once. Without turning around, she spoke softly. Tomorrow morning, they read Mr. Bennett's final letter. Morning light stretched across the Bennett conference hall windows slowly. The city looked softer beneath pale gray skies today. Nobody rushed through the building halls anymore. Nobody whispered behind closed office doors either. Amara sat beside the front table quietly. She wore simple navy clothes and small silver earrings. No cleaning cart stood beside her anymore. No supply gloves rested near her hands. Yet somehow she looked more like herself today. Calm looked natural on her now. Evelyn stood near the podium carefully. She unfolded Harold's final letter slowly. The room stayed completely still afterward. "If you are hearing this," Evelyn read quietly. "Then Amara finally knows everything." Amara lowered her eyes gently. "I never wanted to give her money only. I wanted to give her freedom." Silence settled across the room warmly. She spent years helping people without needing attention. She never asked who deserved kindness first. That is why she deserves everything. Amara smiled softly without speaking. The smile looked small but real. Across the room, Richard sat alone quietly. No executive stood beside him anymore. No assistants waited near his chair either. His phone stayed face down beside his hand. Nobody called today. Nobody interrupted him today. Richard watched Amara carefully from across the room. 20 years ago, he walked away from a small apartment. He walked away from old furniture and unpaid bills. He thought he left weakness behind that night. Today he finally understood something painful. He never walked away from weakness. He walked away from the strongest people in his life. Amara slowly stood after the letter ended. Several employees near the doorway smiled toward her naturally. One woman quietly touched her shoulder and thanked her. Another employee held the door open for her. Nobody overlooked her anymore. Richard looked down quietly. That hurt more somehow. Amara walked toward the large windows slowly. Morning sunlight touched her face gently. Richard looked at her one last time. He did not stand up. He did not follow her. Some distances finally become permanent. Amara looked out over Chicago quietly. Then she spoke softly without turning around. My mother spent years teaching me something important. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Love is not who stays in your heart. Love is who helps you stand after they leave. Richard slowly closed his eyes. Amara never looked back afterward. She did not need answers anymore. She did not need apologies either. 20 years earlier, he needed her to disappear. Today he finally saw her clearly. But she no longer needed to be seen.